Fierce, hungry fighting dog discovers an abandoned baby. What happens next will move you to tears. In a quiet, abandoned place, a fierce, hungry dog named Bruno stumbles upon a helpless baby. What happens next is a remarkable story of instinct, courage, and transformation that will touch your heart. Stay tuned to witness this extraordinary tale of survival and unexpected love. Bruno had been wandering for days now, hunger gnawing relentlessly at his insides. His powerful body, once hardened from brutal fights, was weakening, but he moved forward, his instincts driving him to survive. Then a scent hit his nose, a faint, strange scent, unlike anything he was used to. His stomach growled, his mind racing at the thought of prey. Every fiber of him came alive, sharpening into a hunter's focus. He lowered his head and prowled forward, muscles tensed, breath held. The smell was growing stronger. He could hear something too, a faint sound, barely audible. It was weak, fragile, but it was alive. His mouth watered and his pace quickened as he moved through the tall grass toward the sound. Then he saw it. There, nestled in a bundle of frayed blankets, was a tiny human, baby, small and helpless, its thin cries barely breaking the quiet. Bruno froze, his eyes locked on the infant. The smell he had followed, the one that had spurred him forward in hunger, wasn't prey, wasn't food. It was a fragile, living creature lying defenseless before him. A powerful instinct flared up, urging him to turn, to walk away before the hunger overcame him. But something else held him rooted to the spot, something unfamiliar, something he barely understood. Bruno took a step closer, his massive frame casting a shadow over the tiny figure. The baby whimpered, a weak sound that tugged at him in a way he couldn't quite explain. Bruno's instincts wrestled within him. Hunger clawed at him, yet another feeling rose, stronger than his need to eat. It was the need to protect. He didn't know where it came from, didn't understand it, but as he looked down at the baby, his fierce instincts began to soften. His body, once tensed in hunger, relaxed as he stepped closer, lowering his head until his nose was mere inches from the baby's small, fragile body. He let out a soft whine, unsure of what to do next, yet knowing he couldn't leave. His hunger lingered, but a deep, primal urge to guard and shield this vulnerable creature was overpowering it, consuming him in a way he hadn't felt before. Slowly, cautiously, Bruno lay down beside the child, curling his large body around it like a shield. He felt the baby's warmth against him, heard its heartbeat, fragile but steady beneath the thin blankets, and for the first time in his life he knew he wouldn't be moving on alone. Bruno lay beside the baby, his large body wrapped protectively around the tiny figure as dusk deepened into night. The air cooled and he could feel the baby shiver slightly against him. Its breaths were shallow, its cries weak, fading into small whimpers. Instinctively, Bruno nudged it gently with his nose, trying to offer some of his own warmth. The strange urge to protect the child was growing stronger, weaving itself around his hunger, quieting his survival instincts. A low growl rumbled from his stomach, hunger clawing at him once more. He pushed the feeling down, though his body trembled with exhaustion. The baby shifted, letting out another weak cry, a sound so soft and pitiful that Bruno's protective instinct surged even stronger. He sniffed the baby's face, its scent unfamiliar but somehow comforting. He didn't know why, but this tiny, helpless creature had become his responsibility. His hunger would have to wait. Bruno lifted his head, scanning the dim surroundings, his ears pricked for any sign of danger. The area was open, exposed, and instinct told him he needed to find shelter soon. He stood, his legs stiff and weary, but his resolve stronger than ever. Gently, he picked up the corner of the baby's blanket in his teeth, lifting the child carefully from the cold ground. As he padded forward, Bruno's instincts sharpened, attuned to every sound and movement around him. The distant rustling of leaves, the faint hoot of an owl, the scent of damp earth. All these details filled his senses as he moved, baby secure in his gentle grip. Step by step, he ventured deeper into the darkening landscape, seeking anything that could offer them a safe place to rest. Despite the strain in his muscles, despite the emptiness gnawing at his stomach, Bruno pressed on. His entire world had narrowed down to a single purpose: keeping the baby safe. The night was settling into a deep, chilling quiet. Bruno's legs ached as he carried the baby, his steps slow but steady. The landscape around them was changing. The open, barren stretch of land was giving way to thicker brush and scattered trees. Every shadow seemed to flicker and shift, and Bruno's ears remained alert, every rustle heightening his tension. As he moved, the scent of water drifted to him, faint but unmistakable. Thirst burned at the back of his throat, his tongue dry and rough. The baby, too, needed water. Its tiny, fragile whimpers were growing weaker. Bruno's protective instincts urged him forward, faster now, as the smell of water grew stronger, pulling him like a lifeline. Finally, through the trees, Bruno caught sight of a small creek winding through a grove of thick bushes. The sight stirred a flicker of relief inside him. He gently set the baby down on the soft earth and dipped his head into the water, drinking deeply. Cold liquid was a balm, soothing his parched throat and giving him a brief reprieve from the fatigue weighing down his body. Once he had drunk his fill, Bruno nudged the baby's blanket closer to the water's edge. He carefully nudged some water toward the baby with his nose, wetting its lips, hoping it would revive the little one. After a moment, the baby stirred, a faint, instinctual movement toward the moisture. Watching the baby cling to life, Bruno felt an unexpected surge of something more than just duty. It was loyalty, a fierce and protective loyalty that he hadn't known since he'd been abandoned. For the first time, he felt a connection, a reason to keep going. Bruno looked around, his instincts calling him to find them a safer place for the night. With one last nudge to the baby's blanket, he took up the child carefully in his mouth once again. As he moved, the creek's murmur faded behind them, and the trees began to grow denser, offering more shelter from the wind. Finally, Bruno spotted what looked like a cluster of large rocks that formed a small overhang, a potential refuge. He carefully laid the baby down within the shelter of the rocks, positioning himself so that his body would block any chill that might seep through. Curling around the tiny figure, Bruno closed his eyes, letting the weight of exhaustion settle over him. Tonight, his hunger and pain could wait. For now, he had a mission: to protect the helpless child who had somehow become his own. Bruno awoke just before dawn, his body stiff and sore from sleeping on the cold ground. The chill of the early morning air seeped through his thick fur, and he shifted his body closer to the baby, wrapping around it to share warmth. The child was breathing softly, a fragile rhythm that Bruno found himself listening to as the darkness faded. But they couldn't stay here. Bruno lifted his head, glancing around their small rock shelter. They needed better protection, somewhere enclosed that could shield them from the elements and any possible predators. A faint rustling sound reached his ears, snapping him to alertness. Bruno tensed, his muscles ready, but the noise was just a small animal scampering through the underbrush. He exhaled, but the urgency to move had been reignited. Gathering the baby once again in his mouth, he set off at a careful pace, his senses finely tuned to every sound and scent. The trees were growing closer together, and the air around them felt damp and cold. He pushed forward, his legs beginning to shake with exhaustion, but he knew stopping wasn't an option. They had gone only a short distance when he encountered his first real obstacle, a steep hill, slick with morning dew blocking their path. Bruno hesitated, glancing up at the slope. It would be a hard climb with the baby in his mouth, especially with his own body weak and strained from hunger, but he had no choice. Lowering his head, he took the first cautious step, his paws sinking into the mud. With each step, his muscles screamed, his body threatening to give out. The weight of the baby slowed him down, forcing him to dig his claws into the muddy slope for balance. His breathing grew heavy, but he pressed on, a tiny heartbeat in his mouth keeping him going. He slipped once, nearly losing his grip, but he quickly steadied himself, growling softly in frustration. Step by step, he scaled the hill, his body trembling from the effort. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the top. Bruno paused, panting heavily, his legs quivering beneath him. He glanced down at the baby, making sure it was safe. It was still nestled within the folds of its blanket, its tiny face barely visible. Beyond the hill, a small clearing opened up, and at the far edge stood a crumbling, abandoned cabin, barely visible through the fog. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, a roof, walls, and a safe place to rest. Bruno's heart swelled with relief. He took one last steadying breath and made his way toward it, knowing he'd finally found a place where they could be safe. As Bruno approached the cabin, the early morning fog cast an eerie quiet over the clearing. His keen instincts sensed a tension in the air, a prickling feeling that made his fur bristle. He paused, scanning the surroundings with sharp, alert eyes. The baby whimpered faintly, and Bruno lowered his head, nudging it gently to calm it. But his body stayed tense, every muscle ready to spring. A sudden movement caught his eye, a shadow darting between the trees. His heart raced as he recognized it immediately, a pair of yellow, gleaming eyes peering from the underbrush. Another set appeared, then another. Coyotes. They had been lurking, waiting, and now they had spotted him and the baby. Bruno's entire body tensed, and a low growl rumbled deep in his throat. He could see the coyotes advancing slowly, their bodies low to the ground, eyes fixed hungrily on him and his tiny charge. Bruno lowered the baby gently onto the ground behind him, positioning himself between it and the advancing predators. His hunger and exhaustion faded into the background as a primal surge of protectiveness filled him, every sense on high alert. The lead coyote stepped closer, baring its teeth in a fierce snarl, eyes narrowed with deadly intent. Bruno stood his ground, his powerful body low and braced, growling louder, his sharp teeth bared in warning, but he knew they were outnumbered. He was just one dog weakened from days without food. He could feel his strength fading, but he would not back down, not with the baby behind him, so fragile and helpless. One of the coyotes lunged. Bruno met it head-on, his jaws snapping, catching the coyote's shoulder. The animal yelped, retreating, but another one closed in from his left, aiming for his hind leg. Bruno twisted, managing to land a blow, but the third coyote darted forward, its teeth sinking into his shoulder. Bruno snarled, jerking his body to shake it off, ignoring the pain that shot through him. For a moment he was surrounded, the coyotes circling him, closing growls deep and menacing. His stance, unyielding and fierce, seemed to give the coyotes pause. The leader hesitated, its eyes meeting Bruno's, and something in Bruno's unwavering gaze must have warned it that this dog would fight to his last breath. Slowly, the coyotes backed away one by one until they melted back into the underbrush, their eyes lingering before they disappeared. Bruno stayed alert, his gaze fixed on the shadows until he was sure they were gone. His body ached from the fight, fresh wounds stinging, but he ignored the pain and turned back to the baby. Gently he nuzzled it, checking to make sure it was safe. The baby's faint cries had quieted, and Bruno felt a wave of relief wash over him. Despite everything, he had protected it. With a deep breath, Bruno nudged the baby's blanket into place, then picked it up carefully, guiding them both toward the cabin. He stumbled slightly, his injuries slowing him, but he refused to stop. They were so close now. Shelter was just ahead, and he was determined to see them both through. Bruno limped toward the dilapidated cabin. Each step labored from the fight. His shoulder throbbed where the coyote had bitten him, but he kept his grip steady on the baby's blanket, focused only on reaching the safety of the shelter. The cabin was small, with a roof sagging in one corner, and walls worn from years of harsh weather. Vines crawled up one side, and broken windows allowed streaks of early morning light to pierce through the dusty interior. But to Bruno, it was a sanctuary. It had walls, a roof, enough to shield them from the wind and keep other animals out. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, letting it creak heavily as it swung inward. Dust filled the air as he stepped inside, and he laid the baby gently on a patch of soft, dry dirt near the wall, positioning himself between it and the door. The morning sun filtered in through the broken windows, casting a soft glow on the child's face. Bruno nudged the blanket around the baby, trying to make it as comfortable as he could. His protective instincts settled as he watched the baby breathe in soft, shallow rhythms, its tiny fingers twitching faintly. A strange calm washed over him, stronger than any feeling he'd ever known. Bruno lowered himself beside the baby, letting his body shield it from the draft blowing through the gaps in the walls. He rested his head on his paws, his body finally relaxing, even as his wounds throbbed and the hunger clawed at him once more. But now, hunger felt secondary, an echo compared to the feeling of responsibility that grounded him. Protecting the baby was his sole purpose. He lay there, eyes half closed, his senses still attuned to every creak and groan of the old cabin. The baby stirred. Bruno lifted his head, sniffing to check that all was well. He let out a soft whine almost instinctively, as if to reassure the child that it was safe. The hours passed in silence, the soft light of day casting warmth over them as they both rested hidden and protected within the abandoned shelter. For now they were safe. Bruno lay protectively beside the baby, his ears twitching with every sound outside the cabin as the sun rose higher, filtering soft light through the broken windows. The baby was still asleep, its breathing steady, and Bruno let himself relax just a little. For now they were safe. Then, the sound of footsteps, distant, crunching through the underbrush, pricked his ears to full alert. Bruno's head shot up and his body tensed as he sniffed the air. The scent was unfamiliar yet unmistakably human. His muscles coiled, ready to defend the child if needed, as the footsteps drew nearer, approaching the cabin. A figure stepped into view outside. A woman dressed in hiking clothes, her face streaked with sweat, her expression one of concern and confusion as she spotted the cabin. She had likely seen the cabin from the trail and wandered over, looking for a place to rest. But as her eyes fell on Bruno, who was half hidden in shadow, her steps faltered. Bruno met her gaze, his eyes fierce yet somehow pleading. His body remained rooted between her and the baby, a silent warning. The woman's eyes widened as she took in the scene, a massive dog, scarred and battle-worn, lying protectively beside a tiny baby bundled in a worn blanket. The woman hesitated, lifting her hands slowly in a gesture of peace. "Hey there, boy," she said softly, her voice calm but filled with compassion. "I'm not here to hurt you." Bruno's gaze softened just a fraction as he watched her carefully. There was something in her voice, a gentle tone that he hadn't heard in a long time, and he found himself lowering his head just slightly, though he kept his body planted firmly between her and the child. The woman took a cautious step forward, her eyes fixed on the baby. She could see that the child was alive, but pale and weak, as if it hadn't been cared for in days. Her eyes shifted back to Bruno, and she seemed to understand. This dog, this fierce, loyal creature, had protected the child against all odds. Her heart clenched, moved by the sight of his loyalty. "Is it okay if I get closer?" she asked gently. Bruno remained still, but his rigid stance softened ever so slightly, as though he sensed her good intentions. She knelt, keeping her movements slow, and carefully reached out to brush her fingers against the baby's blanket. The child stirred. Bruno leaned forward, watching the woman's every move. After a few moments, the woman straightened, her face resolute. She reached for her phone, dialing quickly. "Yes, I found them," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "There's a baby and a dog. You won't believe this. He's been protecting the baby. Yes, we'll need emergency services. Please hurry." As she spoke, she glanced back down at Bruno, her eyes filling with tears. "You did so well," she murmured softly, her voice breaking. "You kept this baby safe. You're a hero." Bruno's gaze remained steady, yet something in her words stirred a feeling of calm in him. He had done his job. Help was on its way. For the first time since he'd started this journey, he felt the weight of his exhaustion settle over him. He lay down beside the baby once more, his head resting near the child's tiny form, knowing he could finally let his guard down. Moments after the call, The sound of sirens cut through the quiet, growing louder as emergency vehicles neared the cabin. Bruno perked up, his exhaustion lifting just enough for him to raise his head and listen, his protective instincts still alive. The baby stirred beside him, its small hands curling into fists as the sirens drew nearer. The first responders approached the cabin cautiously. They had been warned that a large protective dog was with the baby, and they could see Bruno's scarred, muscular form crouched over the child as if guarding a priceless treasure. Bruno's ears flattened as he watched them enter, a low growl rumbling in his throat. He wasn't about to abandon his duty yet, not until he was certain the baby would be safe. One of the paramedics, an older man with gentle eyes and a calm voice, knelt down and spoke softly to Bruno. "Hey there, buddy. You're okay. We're here to help." He kept his movement slow, reaching a hand forward to let Bruno catch his scent. "You did a good job keeping this little one safe." Bruno's growl faded, his tired body relaxing as he sensed the man's kindness. He watched as the paramedic gently scooped the baby into his arms, wrapping it securely in a clean, warm blanket. The baby let out a soft whimper. Bruno's ears perked, his gaze fixed on the paramedic, unwilling to look away until he knew the child was safe. As the paramedics carried the baby toward the waiting ambulance, Bruno tried to stand, his body weak and shaky, but one of the rescuers knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his side. "Easy there, big guy," she murmured, her voice soothing. "You're coming with us too. You've earned it." Bruno allowed himself to be guided toward the ambulance, his body finally giving in to exhaustion as he collapsed onto a soft blanket they laid out for him. For the first time, he let his eyes close fully, trusting that the baby was safe now. Through a haze, he could hear the murmurs of the rescuers around him, voices filled with awe as they spoke about his bravery and loyalty. News spread quickly, and by the time they reached the hospital, a small crowd had gathered, all eager to catch a glimpse of the dog, who had defied his own instincts to protect a helpless child. Cameras flashed as Bruno was carefully lifted from the ambulance, and people spoke in hushed, reverent tones. As he was taken inside, one of the rescuers reached out, gently scratching him behind the ears. "You're a hero, you know that?" she whispered, her eyes misting. Bruno, though barely conscious, gave a soft huff, resting his head back down. He had done what he had set out to do. He had saved the child. Inside the hospital, Bruno lay curled on a soft mat, his exhausted body finally able to rest. His wounds had been treated, his fur cleaned, and his hunger soothed with food and water. Yet even as he drifted in and out of sleep, his thoughts seemed to circle back to one thing: the baby. Meanwhile, nurses and doctors worked around the clock to care for the child. The baby, malnourished but stable, had quickly become the center of attention. Word of Bruno's protective journey had spread, and soon the story reached a young couple who had recently suffered the heartbreak of being unable to have children of their own. Touched by the tale of survival and loyalty, they reached out, drawn to the child, and strangely, to the dog as well. A few days later, Bruno stirred as familiar voices approached, the scents immediately recognizable. He lifted his head to see the couple carrying the baby, the same child he had protected. Bruno's body tensed with anticipation, his amber eyes fixed on them as they gently lowered the baby toward him. The child reached out, tiny fingers brushing Bruno's fur, and Bruno felt a rush of warmth, a feeling as powerful as his instincts had been on that first night. The couple knelt beside him, and the woman stroked Bruno's head, her voice soft with gratitude. "You saved our little one," she whispered. "We'd love for you to be with us, Bruno. You're part of our family now." Bruno looked up at her, something deep within him stirring. This was more than shelter. It was a family, a pack, and an unbreakable bond. With a low, contented huff, he pressed his head into her hand, his heart swelling with something he hadn't known he could feel: belonging. In the weeks that followed, Bruno found himself in a home filled with warmth and laughter. Every morning he would wake beside the baby, watching over it as it slept, his powerful frame a gentle guard. The scars of his past faded, both inside and out, replaced by the softness of a new life. He had transformed from a dog built to fight into a guardian, his once battered heart healed by the very life he had protected. He no longer roamed aimlessly, no longer woke to uncertainty. Now he had a purpose, to watch over the family he had chosen, the one that had embraced him with open arms. Months passed and Bruno had become an inseparable part of his new family. His days were filled with peace, warmth, and purpose. Every morning he would settle beside the baby. Now Bruno simply lay still, his eyes gentle, his heart full. On a sunny afternoon, the family gathered in their backyard, the baby toddling on the grass, Bruno close by, every move of his body signaling his alertness. The mother looked over, smiling as she watched the two together, her heart swelling at the sight of the dog who had once been a fighter, now the gentlest of guardians. She knelt beside Bruno, running her hand along his thick, warm fur. "You're a miracle, you know that?" she whispered. Bruno's tail thumped softly against the grass, his eyes meeting hers with an understanding that needed no words. In those eyes, she could see the depth of his loyalty, the journey he had taken from abandoned and broken, deeply loved. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the yard, Bruno lay down, the baby curling up beside him. Two drifted off together, peaceful and safe, wrapped in the warmth of their new world. Bruno's last thoughts before sleep took him was simple. He was home, and he was loved the story of, and the power of kindness. Bruno had shown that love could transform even the hardest of hearts, and that sometimes the most unexpected bonds become the strongest. This heartwarming story reminds us of the incredible power of love and loyalty, even in the most unexpected places. Bruno's transformation from a fierce fighter to a gentle guardian shows us that kindness and compassion can overcome even the darkest circumstances. It's a beautiful reminder that we all have the capacity to protect, care, and love deeply. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales. See you in the next video.